Folks coming in, we're in Romans chapter 11. Romans 11. We're not going to be covering the entire chapter this morning, but we will cover most of it as we've been going through Paul's letter to the Romans. And something we have observed together is that Romans 9 through 11 is the next major section where Paul is grappling with how is it that God's covenant people, the Jews, in large part did not embrace Jesus as Lord and Savior. And that's really hard for Paul as he tries to put his arms around that and figure that out. So that's what he's discussing. And he's going to spend a lot of time talking about God's mercy and grace. So we're going to be looking at that together. Something that I have observed with you is that there are numerous Old Testament quotations. There's sometimes when he'll allude to a passage here or there as well, but in chapters 9 through 11 alone, there are some 30 Old Testament quotations, and the ones that are highlighted in yellow are the ones we'll be covering this morning. So who do you think Paul is primarily addressing in Romans 9 through 11 when he has just a ton of Old Testament quotations? Yeah, Jews. What's interesting is in the verses that we'll be looking at this morning, he's actually going to say, now I'm going to talk to you Gentiles. He'll actually pause and say, now I'm going to focus on you all in verse 13 of Romans 11. So not that the Gentiles are excluded by any means from any of this discussion, but he's primarily grappling with how his fellow countrymen are not embracing Jesus, and is making him rethink God's relationship throughout their history, their 1,500-year history up to this point. All right, 1 Kings 19 is the first passage that we'll be thinking about. We touched on that briefly last week. We're going to divide chapter 11 into 4 parts. Really, the middle two are one section, verses 11 through 24, but we're going to break it down a little bit, and that's what we're going to try to cover through verse 24 today. We started last week with Paul talking about this idea of a remnant. A remnant under the old covenant was saved, and what Paul is saying is that's what God's doing now. He has a remnant of Jews who have accepted Jesus, and we should not be surprised by that. So in light of a great number of the Israelite people rejecting Jesus, Paul asks this question as he begins this section, Romans 11, verse 1. I asked then, did God reject his people? And what's his answer? Don't even think such a thing. It's not that God has rejected Israel. In fact, he gives an example. And who is the example of a Jew who is a Christian? Himself. I am an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. Then he starts talking about Elijah. Now, we don't know what tribe Elijah was from. It is suggested he might have been a Benjaminite. Makes me wonder if that's what Paul thinks, in light of the fact he mentions his tribal ancestry, his own. But he's proud to be a Benjaminite. His name was Saul, named after what other famous Benjaminite? Saul, the King Saul, as a matter of fact. So he's very proud of that. Be that as it may, he starts talking about Elijah and how in 1 Kings 19, when Elijah started telling God, well, I'm it. There's nobody else, and I'm ready to give up because there is no other faithful person in the northern kingdom of Israel. And so he actually quotes here. 1 Kings 19, verse 10, and as we observed last week, he's also quoting verse 14. Why? Why is Paul, by quoting verse 10, also quoting 1 Kings 19, verse 14? Because they're the same. What is the question, do you remember, that God asked Elijah in verse 9 and then in verse 13? What are you doing here, Elijah? What was Elijah doing in 1 Kings 19? We're not going to go back and look at it for the sake of time this morning. But he was hiding. Hiding from Jezebel. And having a pity party. That's exactly right. One of the great lessons we can learn from Elijah is great men of God can get discouraged. Is it normal? I'm not saying it's necessarily right. Is it normal for us to get overwhelmed with discouragement and disappointment? It's just normal. It's just part of life. We all have ups and downs. And for a lot of reasons, I think Elijah was facing a down in his life after the tremendous victory atop Mount Carmel. And I think in large part it's because he was trying to handle things himself. He was burned out, and he is here in 1 Kings 19, as Paul quotes him, saying, I'm it! They've killed everybody! And I alone am left, and they seek my life. There's a lot of truth to that, but there's also a lot of not truth. Was Elijah alone? He felt alone, but he was not alone. What's really important here is Paul's next question. What is God's reply to him? That's what we need to hear. Enough with your excuse-making, Elijah. What does God say to you? And that's when he quotes verse 18. What does God say to him in reply? Actually, Elijah, I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. So what is God telling Elijah in his response, as Paul cites it in Romans 11, verse 4? You're not alone. And more than that, I mean, yes, it's a small number in comparison to the overall nation, but God is always going to have a remnant. I have kept for myself, he says. Okay, absolutely. God has done a lot with small numbers. That is exactly right. So which should we be discouraged? Here we are, a congregation of 150, 160 folks in a growing city. And you pass by and you see these large churches that are building even larger auditoriums. And it makes us feel like, well, wait a minute, we've got the truth, we've got the gospel. Why aren't people flocking to it? And what does the Lord say? I mean, we're it. We're alone. What does God say? And what I love about 1 Kings 19 is that God proceeds to tell him, and Paul doesn't specifically go into this, but what Paul tells Elijah is, I've got work for you to do, Elijah. I've got you to go anoint this king, and I got you to, you need to appoint your successor, Elisha. Let's get busy here. There's work to do. Paul's focus, though, is on how God has a remnant, and this remnant is by his grace. And you can see it highlighted there on the screen, the term grace. Verse 4, what is God's reply to him? I have kept for myself 7,000 men who have not bowed the knee to Baal. And I can do a lot with 7,000 people, let me tell you, God says. So too, at the present time, there is a remnant, chosen by grace. But if it is by grace, and it is no longer on the basis of works, otherwise grace would no longer be grace. Elijah was trying to save the nation by his own power, by his own works. And we need to do the best we can. But ultimately, who is the one who causes the increase? God. Who is the one who touches people's hearts with the gospel? We can plant and water, but God is the one who causes the increase. And that includes in your life. We all need God's grace. Here's the problem, though. Verse 7. Verse 7 says, what then? What happened? Well, I'll tell you what happened. Israel failed to obtain what it was seeking. The elect obtained it, but the rest were hardened. If you're looking in your Bible, I don't have it on the screen to show you, but in verse 5, that term chosen, a remnant chosen by grace, it's the same exact term as elect in verse 7. So the remnant, God's people, they have obtained what Israel was seeking. What was Israel seeking? And this is going back to the earlier discussion he had earlier. They're seeking the Messiah. They're seeking someone to save them, salvation. And they did not obtain it. Why not? The remnant did, the small number of people did, but the rest were hardened. What does that mean, to be hardened? They went their own way. That is exactly right. I'm going to show you the 4 references to hardened in Romans. The first one was all the way back in chapter 2, verse 5. And who is Paul addressing specifically in chapter 2? What ethnicity? The Jewish people, as a matter of fact. But because of your hard and impenitent heart, you are storing up wrath for yourself on the day of wrath, when God's righteous judgment will be revealed. Romans 9, verse 18, where he's actually quoting from Exodus, or alluding to it. He has mercy on whomever he wills. He hardens whomever he wills. Talking about Pharaoh specifically, when God said, Moses, tell him, let my people go, and Pharaoh hardened his heart. And by saying this, the Lord hardened his heart. He did not want to do what God wanted him to do. The verse we're looking at here, Romans 11, verse 7, the elect obtained it, the few, the remnant, but the rest of the Jewish people were hardened. And then we're going to get to this next week, but Paul says in verse 25, and this is the last time hardening is used, a partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. The hardening is caused by Israel's unbelief. They refuse to accept Jesus as the Messiah. Why not? Why don't they accept Jesus as the Messiah?
Because they're looking for a physical event, not a spiritual.
Okay. Ma'am? Preconceived notions? Exactly. Both of you are absolutely correct. They have an idea of what they want, but it's not how God does things. The church, the very idea of a church, rather than a king who rules on a literal throne, people who love each other and serve each other and serve the world through compassion and love. That's not what they wanted. Jesus was filled with compassion and taught us to emulate him, to eschew sin and stay away from it. That's not what the world wants to hear. And so they have hardened their heart. As we have said before, the same sun that hardens clay softens butter. It's not that God chose these people and said, all right, arbitrarily, everybody else isn't. Because what is Romans 1 through 8 all about? Chapters 1 through 8 of Romans. What is it about? That God made people believe? It's that anyone who believes can be saved, Jew and Gentile alike. In these chapters, Paul is grappling. Here's an inspired author who is trying to work through, reason through, how is it that God's covenant people were unfaithful? And I said, here's one of the answers. God said, this is what I want, this is my plan, and they didn't want it. They hardened their hearts. As it is written, and here he quotes Isaiah 29, verse 10, God gave them a spirit of stupor, eyes that would not see, and ears that would not hear, down to this very day. What does this suggest to you? Is this God making them not want to hear, not want to see?
He knew their hearts.
Okay, he knew their hearts.
He gave them over to whatever their choices were.
Okay, you remember in Romans 1 when 3 times Paul says about the world, God gave them up to their passions. God gave them up to idolatry. Let them. When you are insistent that you want to go down a certain path, you know what God will do? He'll let you. He'll let you delude yourself, run headlong into sin. Now, God is the creator of the universe. This is not an easy, simple topic. How does God, in his providence, allow people to rush headlong into sin, and yet at the same time, he does not want anyone to perish? He wants all to come to repentance. So does God give up on his people who reject him? May it never be. God forbid. Don't even think such a thing. And yet, here he is saying, if you want to reject God, he's going to let you. He's not going to stop you. This is free will. This is our ability to choose. And that's the lesson for us. Here's another quotation, this one from Psalm 69, that says, even harsher, let their table become a snare and a trap, a stumbling block and a retribution for them. Let their eyes be darkened so that they cannot see, and bend their backs forever. This is one of those imprecatory sections of the Psalms where David is praying horrible, awful things on his enemies, and Paul is applying them to the enemies of God. Yes, ma'am.
It's important to notice us who believe God, not God who believes us.
All right, absolutely. Absolutely. God is the one who is always wanting his people to come back to him, but he will let them leave. He's not going to make anyone remain faithful. Have you ever experienced this? Someone that you love very much, that you care for deeply, and you see the bad decisions they're making in their life, and there's nothing you can really do to stop them. Anyone? Or parents, employees, employers, about their employees. Even sometimes ourselves. We know we're going down the wrong path, and it's just hard for us to. I mean, the only person you can actually control is yourself, and if you're like me, you have a hard time doing that. We need help. Yes, sir.
I think this part of Romans about the hardening and about the Jewish problem is not there just for historical reference.
Exactly. Yeah.
People are people. We've always had the same problems, and so we have to watch out for this today. You know, just because I grew up in the church and my parents grew up in the church, and we've always done it this way, and so I know we're right. So do the Jews. We have to be careful with that, and we can't think, well, we've always done it this way, so it's got to be right. We have to be able to step back and really think and say, what does God really want us to do, and what does that mean for what I'm doing? And it's possible for us to be wrong in some things.
And what I'm trying to do is apply this letter to help us realize it is talking to us just as much as it is Paul's situation. And don't you love Paul? And the more you study him, the more you see the passion of this man and the honesty. He's just being honest. It's some of the things that Paul says sometimes, you go, wow, he really said that? And he's being very frank and honest about his feelings of how could God let this happen? And he's trying to reason through it. So the main point of verses 1 through 10 is there is a remnant. There's always a remnant. And among God's people, there is a remnant. But there's so many who have rejected him. And yet he is holding out hope. He is holding out hope that they will still come to their senses and be saved. The person that you are longing to turn back and go in the right direction, you never give up. You never give up on your children. Never give up on your spouse. You always hold out hope, because it's not just you working on their heart. God, through his providence, is working on his or her heart as well. All right, verse 11, as we now look at verses 11 through 16 that are going to bring in the Gentiles into the discussion and talk about how the Gentiles have been saved and how God is using that to help with the Jewish situation. So I ask, Did they stumble? I'm saying they did not stumble so that they might fail, did they? Is that what God wanted? He just wanted them to stumble and fall. No, that's not at all what God wanted. But because of their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles in order to make them jealous. This seems to be Paul's way of working through this and saying, oh, okay, I see what God's doing. He's got a plan here. And let me just emphasize that for you in a couple of bullet points. Because the Jews rejected Jesus, salvation was then offered to the Gentiles. And because of the Gentiles responding to the gospel, because of their salvation, the Jews are provoked to jealousy. That's what Paul is understanding here, trying to grapple with this. And so he's saying, well, this bad situation is actually good because it will help them to become believers, help them to become disciples. Verse 12, and I'm putting up here what is really more of a paraphrase to help us get the sense of it, and then we're going to look at the literal reading. Now, if the Gentiles were enriched because the people of Israel turned down God's offer of salvation, that's a lot of words, isn't it? If the Gentiles were enriched, and he uses the word for riches, if they were enriched because the people of Israel turned down God's offer of salvation, think how much greater a blessing the world will share when they finally accept it. How would you paraphrase that? What is Paul saying?
Even though the Jews have rejected God, Jesus, and the Gentiles have come to the salvation, that how much more wonderful will it be for both the world that
Okay.
are Christians, that when the Jews finally do see that Jesus is the Messiah and the salvation.
I couldn't have said that better. Thank you. Do you live in a world that you're kind of disappointed with? Do you look and see your news feed? Do you see what's going on in the world and say, I just love living in 2024 in the United States of America. This is great. Anybody not feel that way every day? Yes, ma'am. You got a hand over here? I'm seeing some movement here. You got a hand up? Oh. See, you can stand? I mean, you better watch out. Yes, ma'am.
Back to Deuteronomy 32, and throughout various
All right, which Paul has quoted, Deuteronomy 32. Yeah.
the Jewish people
Where was
made
that?
God a jealous God by their adultery that they committed against with
And he warned them.
idols, and he warned them. In a sense, this is a little bit of payback, I see, because you know what? You remember back when you made me jealous, now I'm going to make you jealous. Now you're going to
Okay. Very interesting. Very interesting. It was Deuteronomy 30 that he had quoted earlier. I thought he had quoted Deuteronomy 32 as well. Okay. So Israel turned down God's offer of salvation. That's very important. Here is the literal rendering. And I'm making this point in part because I love to read our modern paraphrases, understanding that they are not literal, but they lose something. For example, Paul is making a comparison, and I want you to see this. This is the more literal rendering of Romans 11, verse 12, and I think we're going to get the same message out of it. Now, if their trespass means riches for the world, and if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, how much more their fullness means. And what we can't see here is there's some alliteration going on here with Paul's use of their trespass, their failure, their fullness. Those concepts all go together. And so that helps us to better appreciate Paul's careful construction here. Their trespass means riches for the world. The Jews rejecting the gospel means the Gentiles are accepting the gospel. And if their failure means riches for the Gentiles, so riches for the world, riches for the Gentiles, how much more their full inclusion will mean. What is Paul trying to do here? Make the best of a bad situation. He's really trying. What do you think about Paul's discussion here? When I read this, I'm reading an apostle who doesn't have all the answers, who doesn't write saying, all right, this is what's going on here. He's really grappled with this, and he's trying to get us to walk through his thought process. What do you think about that?
It's just like in the past where they would mess up. They would have that huge period where they had messed up. They were not doing as God had asked. They were not being obedient children to Him. They got themselves into trouble. Then they would go to pray and started doing what they were supposed to be doing. God would redeem them. That fulfillment, that enrichment that they had when they were reinstated with His love and obedience and protection that they got, it's just even going to be even more so now if they accept Jesus
Okay.
as their Messiah.
And what I'm specifically, and all that's great, all that's correct. What I'm focusing on right now is, what do you think about Paul's process of reasoning through this and him sharing that with us? We're studying a 2,000-year-old document that more ink has been spilled over than probably any other book in the Bible. We're looking at Paul's magnum opus, where he is grappling with the essence of what it means to be in a covenant relationship with God. And he's saying, how can my Jewish heritage be for naught in light of the fact that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah? Yes, sir.
I think some of the earnestness of his argument is because he realizes where he came from, and he remembers what it took to convince him. It literally took Jesus pulling him aside one-on-one and disciplining him one-on-one.
That's right.
Where he could not ignore it. And he finally sees the picture, and he's like, well, I don't have available to me what Jesus did to me, but to pass on, I have to come up with an argument that they can understand and they will believe.
Yes, sir.
I'm thinking here, maybe Paul, in his way, is telling them, there's a limited number of Jews. There's a lot of Gentiles in the whole world.
Yes, the rest of the world. If you're not a Jew, you're a Gentile, according to the Jews.
So, it's going to be beneficial if the Gentiles accept the truth.
Absolutely.
If the world accepts the truth and the Jewish nation doesn't, many more will be enriched. It's foolish to think that, but in a way, maybe he's telling them, you should participate in something that came to you first.
Yeah.
If you don't, it's going to be for a whole lot of other people greater than you.
So tonight, in our Bible class, we're going to be looking at the heritage of the Passover and how it applies to the Lord's Supper. So we're Gentiles. We're not ethnically Jews. We're not practicing Judaism as they try to practice it today. And yet, what are we doing? We are going back to the legacy of a 3,500-year-old tradition, the Passover, to help us better understand our relationship, our covenant with Jesus. We're going to be talking about that tonight. Indeed, the Old Testament is speaking to us. Now, what I find interesting here is in verse 13, Paul says, now, all right, I need to talk to you Gentiles for a moment. Inasmuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles, Jesus commissioned him in Acts 9, like you were saying, he appeared to Paul. He commissioned him to be an apostle to the Gentiles. As much as I am supposed to focus on Gentiles, I magnify my ministry in order somehow to make my fellow Jews jealous, and thus save some of them. For if their rejection means the reconciliation of the world, what will their acceptance mean but life from the dead? Now, let's pause here for a moment And think about, why is Paul talking about this to the Roman church? Why is he writing this letter, this unsolicited letter? It's not that Paul went there and then established the church. Rather, he is talking about wanting to go there. What is going on in Rome among the Christians that would prod Paul to talk all about the Jews and the Gentiles and their relationship with the Lord separately and their relationship with each other?
Persecutions, mostly towards any that become Christians.
Okay.
Starting off by the Jews.
All right. What else?
Persecuting them and getting the Roman government involved in persecution.
Okay. What else? Something we haven't really emphasized. Paul writing this letter around AD 57, there was the Edict of Claudius. If I'm remembering correct, it was AD 49 or so, when all the Jews were kicked out of Rome. And that included a married couple we know about. What were their names? Aquila and Priscilla. And of course, they became companions of Paul because he met them in Ephesus. But they had been in Rome. And so if you have all the Jews in the church kicked out, and the years later they filter back after Claudius died, and you've got Gentile elders now, you've got Gentile leaders, and you're a Jew who used to be in that church, and you're coming back now, what's going to happen? When you come back and there's somebody sitting in your pew, there's conflict here. And that's what Paul is getting at. This is a situational letter. There was for the longest time the mentality among Bible scholars that Paul had time while he is in Corinth to write this letter. He had months to craft his dissertation on justification by faith. But as people begin to take a closer look at what he actually is saying, they begin to realize this is a situational letter, just like all of his other letters. There's a reason why he is addressing these topics. And so he says, I'm speaking to you Gentiles. When Paul, on his missionary journeys, would go to a city, what was the first place he would always go to? To Jews or to Gentiles? To Jews. He would always go to a synagogue of Jews, if there was one in the city. But isn't he the apostle to the Gentiles? Shouldn't he just be ignoring the Jews? No. And yet, after the Jews would reject the gospel, what would Paul then do? Wipe the dust off his feet, shake the dust off his shoes, sandals, and go on to the Gentiles, and make the Jews jealous. Unfortunately, they got so jealous they wanted to kill them numerous times, didn't they? Oh, I want them to become Jews. I want them to become, I want the Jews to become Christians. All right, then he says this in verse 16. Because the whole premise here is, listen, Gentiles, God has not rejected the Jews. He has not rejected them. He says this in verse 16. If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. If the root is holy, so are the branches. Huh? What's he talking about? If the dough offered as first fruits is holy, so is the whole lump. This is where sometimes it is helpful to read a commentary or to read a paraphrase. And what I just read is the literal ESV. Here's how the New Living Translation interprets this for us. Now, it's up to us to read it and say, is this right? Is this really what he's talking about? And what he's saying is the dough that was offered as first fruits is referring to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They're the ones who entered into a covenant relationship with God before Exodus 19, before they entered into a covenant with God as a nation. God entered into a covenant relationship with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Surely their descendants then are also going to be holy. So I'm just trying to explain the text, trying to get us to understand it based on what Paul is saying. Now, the Jewish people are not Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. They're not of the caliber of Abraham, per se. What he's saying, though, is if they're descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, surely they can become faithful to the Lord. And so he uses this idea of bread, a lump being the dough becoming a lump of bread. And they've got these roots in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then he starts talking about a tree. If the root is holy, so are the branches. He dumps the lump. He doesn't talk about the lump anymore, but he then, in verses 17 through 24, talks about this idea of a tree, an olive tree. So what's at the root? God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that he then promised to the nation, that through Abraham, all nations of the earth will be blessed. And it's great that the Gentiles have become Christians, but what about the original nation? What about the Jewish people? That's at the heart of what he's talking about here. And now he needs to talk to the Gentiles, because if you make the Jews jealous, how then will the Gentiles respond when they go, we're now the people that God favors, not you Jews? And so how are the Gentiles maybe going to respond to their fellow Jews, especially the ones who maybe used to be in leadership, have come back to Rome? They're going to be proud. And of course, you know the analogy that he's going to talk about. And so we're going to move on to that. There's a lot of emphasis on branches in these verses. And so I pick up verse 16 because it goes right into verse 17, where he says, if the root is holy, so are the branches. And there's a bunch of if statements. We've already seen several of these. Verse 12, now if their trespass. Verse 15, if their rejection. Verse 16, if the dough. Verse 17, if some of the branches were broken off. That's Jews who didn't accept Jesus, and so God broke them off. If some of the branches were broken off, and you, Gentiles, although a wild olive shoot, that's what you are. You're not the pure olive tree that came from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You were grafted in as a wild olive shoot. You were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree. Those promises made to Abraham. All nations of the earth shall be blessed. You're benefiting from the heritage of God's covenant people through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Verse 18. Do not be arrogant toward the branches. So what is going on here in Rome? There's conflict, isn't there? And Paul is trying to get them all to see, we're in the same boat here. We're all sinners. We're all saved by God's grace. We're all in this together. Today, we are going to take a congregational photo. We may all get struck by lightning when we're out there. Why? Why do we want to have a congregational photo?
We're a family.
Because we're a family. And what we want to do is have a family photo. Hope everybody brought their best clothes so we can all look pretty.
In Galatians chapter 3,
Oh, don't be bringing Galatians in here.
only because we're heirs of Abraham.
Yeah, exactly.
There is a link all the way back to the Father.
Right, and Romans 4 also talks about that too, but you're exactly right. I've often referred to, as scholars do, Galatians is the little Romans, and there's a lot of thematic overlap. Of course, you could go into other letters of Paul and say the same thing, but they especially address justification by faith and how Jews and Gentiles alike can become citizens of God's kingdom. All right, so you've got some Jews here who have been broken off. They're no longer in the tree. They don't believe. And then you've got these arrogant branches, Gentiles, saying, yeah, I'm grafted in now. Yeah, I may have been a wild olive branch, but I'm in the tree now. Well, here comes verses 19 through 21. Then you will say, branches were broken off so that I can be grafted in. And that's true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand fast through faith. So, do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. What is absolutely necessary for us to maintain our relationship with God? Faith. Faithful service. We must be faithful. Yes, ma'am.
This right here goes into a lot of the others, letters that it's written about loving our brothers, but even those when they're doing wrong and when they come back.
Of course.
How we're supposed to treat them. This is a brother that he was a Jew and he was wrong. He was broken off, yes, but now he's come back. So we need to make sure that he's treated right, show him love, and help encourage him to do what is right.
Absolutely.
This is a big warning.
You know, there's a lot of topics that Paul could have addressed to the Romans, but this is what he chose. This is his focus. Justification by faith, how we're all saved. Despite our sin, we can all find forgiveness. And then he's bringing in another element, and that is severity. That God can just as easily take you who have been grafted in and pull you out just as easily as he did the Jews. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Now, what do we like to emphasize? And what does the world like to emphasize when they want to talk about God's grace? Oh, yeah, his kindness. Yeah, God's so loving. And he is. But he hates sin. And he cannot tolerate sin. And that's why he provided Jesus. Verse 22, note then the kindness and severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness to you, provided you continue in his kindness. Otherwise, you too will be cut off. So who's he talking to in there in verse 22? Gentiles. And then in verse 23, he says, and even they, and that's referring to Jews, if they do not continue in their unbelief, in other words, if they believe, and this is what he's hoping is going to happen. This statement is saying, I really hope this happens. They will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut off what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted, contrary to nature, into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? God's already done the hard part. He's grafted in wild olive trees. It's going to be that much easier for him to graft in natural olive branches. The expression here, how much more, in verse 24, was also used in verse 12. How much more will their inclusion be? And I think that is binding together all these verses as a beginning and end point called an inclusion, verses 11 through 24. How much more? I don't know for sure if that's true, but in verse 12 and in verse 24, he uses this expression, how much more? And perhaps that is binding together verses 11 through 24. And that's why I want to subdivide chapter 11 into verses 1 through 10, verses 11 through 24. But we broke it up into two parts. And then next week, we will look at verses 25 through 36. Well, once again, I've painted myself in a corner here, and I don't have time to look at this application in any detail. So we will look at it next week. We'll start with this, and this will be a good review for us. But just think about this first one right here with me. What is Paul doing? He's going back to the Old Testament scriptures, and he's saying, I missed something. How is it that the Jews rejected Jesus? And that's what we're doing. We're looking with Paul as our guide to how can we miss it sometimes? How can we just not get it? I love Paul's honesty. I love his passion. And I want to be like him in that I'm willing to examine carefully what I've always believed and try to see what is it that God really wants me to do. Every generation needs to examine the Scriptures and re-examine the Scriptures and develop our own faith. So when we take that photo today and we look at all those young people, and 10 years from now, I want to look at that picture and I want to see every one of those young people still faithful to the Lord. And I pray that that will happen. Thank you for your study of Romans 11, 1 through 24. Next week, we will have some time to review as we finish Romans 11, the second major section of this great letter to the Romans. Thank you.